with starting with our moderator, Liz Thompson. Liz is a Massachusetts native and an independent ecologist and conservationist now based in Vermont. She's worked with land trusts, government agencies, and the University of Vermont, and is currently engaged in outreach and education with wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities. So take it away, Liz. Oh, just a couple of Zoom housekeeping things. We will, of course, ask you to be muted when you're not speaking. Feel free and enter questions into the chat at any time. The speakers will let you know when they're prepared to take other questions, and you can use the raise hand feature if you'd like to be recognized to come off mute and ask the question live. I think those are the main things you need to know. If the pictures are in the way of the people in the room, I think you can click on those and drag them out of the way so you can see the screen. And I'll let Liz take over now. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Rob, and welcome everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for being here. We're here today to talk about an integrated approach to conservation to address the threats of climate change, biodiversity loss, and the challenges to human health. We envision a mix of working and wild forests, vibrant farmlands, healthy marine and freshwater systems, and vital human communities. Getting there will require a combination of policy change, planning, careful stewardship, and land conservation. Our panelists will address all of these. So we will hear from David Foster, Stephanie Cooper, Mark Wamsley, and Amy Sheldon, and I'll introduce them in turn. So when each of them has their opportunity to speak, then I'll say a little bit more about each of them. So starting with David Foster. David is the co-coordinator of Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities. He's an ecologist and director emeritus of the Harvard Forest of Harvard University and president emeritus of the board of Heisted Foundation. David brings to his work a deep, scientifically based understanding of ecology and landscape history, as well as a knowledge of all the aspects of conservation and strong relationships with many conservation leaders in the region. So David, thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Liz, and thanks to everybody for joining us. So I'd like to start by providing a little background and context for our panel, including what do we mean by integration. So we look at this very broadly from many different perspectives, but we certainly mean integrated geographically across land uses, state and regional boundaries, and temporally by placing the conditions today in the context of the past and deep past, as well as envisioning the future to come. But we also mean integration across human and natural spheres as we seek to address the three major crises that are confronting the world today: climate change, the tremendous loss of biodiversity, and the human crises of inequity and declining well-being. These crises are driven by an unjust, extractive economy that has an economic system that has repeatedly undermined both our natural systems and our human communities. We need to address all three of these crises simultaneously by developing a just and sustainable natural landscape, as well as just and sustainable human communities. So I can begin by placing New England in a geographical context. New England is among the most heavily forested regions of the nation, and it forms a critical connection between the expansive Appalachian forests that extend through the southeast down to the Gulf of Mexico and northward to the boreal forest regions of Canada. One of the reasons that we all band together to conserve New England is in part to conserve these continental connections. And then temporally, we need to recognize the tremendous transformation that the region has undergone, especially in the last 500 years, that began with European settlers colonizing the region and extracting the land from native peoples and beginning to deforest it and log it expansively to reach a peak of agricultural deforestation and development in the mid to late 19th century. Fortunately, New England is blessed with a remarkable natural resilience, and in large part, its forests and a substantial amount of its wildlife have actually bounced back with the regional decline in agriculture and despite ongoing human disturbance. But it's important to look even further back than this and to recognize that for about 12,000 years, forests dominated the landscape that we call New England, and expansive old-growth forests governed by natural processes dominated the land and strongly influenced the character of our lakes and our streams. Today, these old-growth forests that are dominated by natural processes cover less than 1% of the region, and wildlands managed passively cover only 3% of the land. Now, the transformation in vegetation cover was accompanied by, and as it was accompanied by a kind of rapacious attitude towards many native species, exerted a tremendous impact on wildlife as well as plant life, as depicted here in this slide. Some few species were extirpated from the region or driven completely extinct. Many species of the deep woods declined hugely and then recovered or were reintroduced as forests returned in the late 19th and 20th centuries, whereas open land species thrived and new species arrived from Midwestern grasslands to peak in our landscape in the mid-19th century. But these species are declining very rapidly in the face of the ongoing increase of woody cover and human activity. Meanwhile, many new species arrived with climate change and with disturbance and the loss of competitors, such as coyote coming in to partially replace the role of wolves in our region. And meanwhile, we await the return, the recovery, the reintroduction of missing major predators such as wolves and cougars. Now, today, the landscape remains incredibly dynamic with land use, especially deforestation for construction, for transportation and solar development, especially in the southern states and along the coast, and harvesting, which occurs in all of our forests, but is most expansive and most intensive in the northern forest region, and especially in the northern part of Maine. So thus, as we look at our landscapes today, although they may appear relatively static, they are recovering from more than 400 years of intensive land use and dramatic changes, and they're continuing to be shaped by land use, by natural disturbances, and by climate change. So in the face of this rather tumultuous change and the ongoing impacts that we're experiencing, a group joined together in the early 2000s to begin releasing a series of reports that outlined a new vision for the New England landscape, a wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities vision that seeks to add a bit of stability to this dynamic situation and to conserve both natural and cultural landscapes while focusing ongoing land use change to a relatively modest fraction of the landscape. Now, the vision is depicted here in this graph, and it shows really a transformation of the condition of our land as we envision up to 70% of the region remaining permanently protected in forest, with at least 10% of the landscape dedicated to wildlands, while much of the surrounding woodlands would be managed actively through ecological forestry. At the same time, we envision 7 to 15% of the land remaining in agriculture and just over 10% of the land in lived landscapes dominated by people, but interfingering with and deriving benefit from our forested and our food-producing lands. Now, our collective effort going forward will focus on expanding and fortifying the region's food supply and distribution systems in an equitable and inclusive way that ensures the availability of adequate, affordable, socially and culturally appropriate products under a variety of rapidly changing both environmental and public health conditions. So in closing, these visions for forests, farms, and even fisheries have an ecological dimension of more diversified, mature, and natural systems, an ecological or economic dimension of more widespread, diversified production of food and wood that supports more producers and generates more products locally, and a social dimension of reconnecting urban and rural communities to the natural systems and products of our region. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. So we will hear now from Stephanie Cooper. We are going to hold questions until the end, and we'll hear now from Stephanie Cooper, and Undersecretary for Environment within the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, with a portfolio including land conservation, park investments, toxics use reduction, and coastal zone management. Stephanie has over 25 years of experience working on parks and open space, conservation, transportation, and environmental protection issues in the public sector. So thanks for being here, Stephanie, and for sponsoring this presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here, and I would say we at Energy and Environmental Affairs are excited to be part of the conference, and Secretary Tepper is very much looking forward to being there on Saturday, as am I. So my part of the presentation is to talk a little bit about government's role in terms of integrated conservation strategies and climate resilience. And David did a wonderful job of talking about all the different ways we can think about integration. And I'll start by talking about how this administration under Governor Healy is taking an integrated approach to tackling climate change. So by appointing the first in the nation cabinet level climate chief, Melissa Hoffer, we have a whole of government approach to climate change. And so what does that really mean? That means, you know, everybody across state government, whether your job is about getting housing built, maintaining roadways, running schools, delivering healthcare, helping people access benefits, it's about tackling climate change. So not to mention, you know, those of us whose jobs center on that. So we know that nature is one of the best climate solutions, right? We all know, and the pictures, you know, cause us to think about how our forests, wetlands, and soils are so powerful in absorbing carbon from the atmosphere and buffering the impacts of extreme precipitation, storms, heat, and fire that I think we used to say we are seeing on a regular basis. And so, you know, all of us in the land conservation community have, for I'm sure many years, talked about the benefits of conservation in terms of public health, drinking water, food, local wood, outdoor recreation, wildlife habitat. And now it's also really, with an overarching focus, it's about climate change. And so for us at the state level, you know, we have our Clean Energy and Climate Plan, which is carrying out statutes that, you know, that we are responsible for fulfilling. And so as part of that, we have commitments to conserve 30% of the state by 2030 and 40% of the state by 2050. And so, you know, what that means is that land conservation, protecting the natural environment is essential, it's required, and our natural infrastructure has become our critical infrastructure. And many of us may have been thinking about that for years, but my point is that the dial is really has shifted. So I'm going to talk about government's role in all of this. And I'm going to talk about obviously the executive branch here in Massachusetts. So what is government best poised to do in advancing this work? So technical assistance, which obviously can take various forms, but the notion of creating, compiling data and tools, making it available to people and organizations to make good decisions when it comes to climate, and we could say, you know, writ large. And then in terms of public funding, you know, we should be directing that funding toward goals and actions that we as sort of a state have agreed upon. And then also prompting those incentives through the requirements that we put with funding. And then, policies and regulations, developing those plans and policy frameworks and compelling action where needed through regulation. And of course, obviously, all developed with public and stakeholder input. But in other words, saying these are sort of the blueprints, these are the frameworks, this is what we're all working toward, and here are the tools that we used to advance the needle. So next slide, I'm going to highlight some programs and initiatives that get at these sort of three pillars. So the first one is our Resilient Mass Plan that was released last year, and every state has to do this kind of plan required by FEMA, identifying what are your biggest hazards and how are you going to adapt to them in terms of climate. This plan in of itself is actually a very integrating document because it's across state government. What are all the actions that we are going to take to address these hazards? And so it covers everything from building codes to public transit. But there are also many elements that are about integrating resilience across conservation-focused initiatives. So one, about developing a coastal resilience strategy, which is something we launched a few months ago called Resilient Coast. So coming up with a plan for our 78 coastal communities for the future. Looking at our very popular food security infrastructure grant program and moving that towards specifically prioritizing proposals that create more resilience to drought and extreme weather in our food security system. Capacity building to help communities carry out more ecological restoration projects for resilience. And so, there are other plans, right? So in this sort of bucket of what government does, but other plans that are relevant to our conversation today, our Healthy Soils Action Plan, which is about how do we conserve, protect, restore, and manage our soils for the future, including for all of the carbon that they hold. Our Farmland Action Plan, which sets forth goals for farmland protection, viability, and access. Our Resilient Lands Initiative, which among other things, calls for no net loss of farmland, but also is an updated set of shared goals for land conservation that are around climate mitigation and resilience, and of course, environmental justice. And I would say in government, part of our job, I feel, is to stick to the plan. So to say these are the goals that we've all agreed to that we need to get to, and to invest in ways that are consistent with that, and to tweak those investments if we're not moving the needle in the way that we think we should, or we find a better way to do it. And a part of that is the legacy that's left behind the funding, creating that capacity at the local and regional level to keep on doing the work. And all of this needs to serve and advance multiple goals at the same time. I mean, that's what true integration is, right? So the next slide is about our Municipal Vulnerability Plan program, the MVP program. So this program was created to help communities identify climate vulnerabilities and create plans to address them. And so it provides funding for both, for planning and implementation, as well as what we call action grants. And we've invested over $140 million in the last 5 years, and the application is open now. There are a lot of projects, and we point people toward, flood mitigation, wetlands restoration, land protection can also happen through this program. So it's part of it is about helping those natural processes to work at maximum strength, is the way I would simply say it, to buffer climate change. We do have a special round this year, which is focused on many communities who were so hard hit by flooding last year, and special funding to help them recover, but recover through promoting nature-based solutions. And here on the slides, you can see that the various different ways we're creating more capacity at the local level. And so next slide is another program in the category of sort of incentivized funding. And this is one that we created about a dozen years ago. And the question that we were grappling with at the time is, how can we government help conserve more large landscapes? And we knew that these large land transactions required partnerships mostly to carry out, and they required having a pool of funding that was secure. So in creating the program, we required partnerships among combinations of state agencies, land trusts, municipalities. And, in terms of the goals, protecting those large landscapes for everything they provide. So for the forest, for carbon, for biodiversity, for connectivity and wildlife, for climate adaptation, for both sustaining working landscapes, and I'll say something more about this in a minute, but also for creating forest reserves. So I would just say that there are a variety of goals that are being advanced all at once. And we have tweaked this funding over time to recognize the different scales of landscapes across the Commonwealth that are all equally important. So next slide. So the last program that I wanted to highlight is called Forest as Climate Solutions. And this is in the category of, policy. We're leading with policy and backing with funding. And so it's a package of policies and programs that we launched last June, which is really looking at all sides of how do we perpetuate our forests in the Commonwealth. And David talked about why that is so important, looking at a sort of regional or even more global level, but wanting to make sure that they continue to provide the myriad benefits that we need from them. So from carbon to wood. And so, yes, this is driven by and centered on our protecting 40% of the state by 2050, but looking at that, how we get there in a lot of different ways. So supporting forest landowners through various incentives so that they can ultimately keep their forests as forests, but manage for different values. Investing more in forest conservation. We know we need to double the pace of land conservation to get to our goals. Special dedicated funding to create more forest reserves. And we imagine, a mosaic of forest lands that are managed across a continuum from passive to active. And we want to have more that are passively managed, whether they're expanding what we have on state lands, but also on private lands, as well as continuing to invest in working lands, which we have done for some time. And then finally, really important, the way that we manage our state lands, and so making sure that we are reflecting the latest climate science. And we convened a panel of experts this last year to give us advice about that. And so they issued their recommendations in January, and we are feverishly reviewing those along with many excellent public comments to help us think about what is our path forward in implementing these recommendations and continuing to advance this initiative. So my last slide here is just about, there's a lot to talk about, right? So I've tried to give you sort of an overview here, but some opportunities and areas where we're going to be continuing to implement and continuing to want to work together. So last fall, Governor Healy issued an executive order charging our Department of Fish and Game to lead a process to develop biodiversity goals for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for 2030, 2040, and 2050. Again, applying across government in an integrated way. So that's something that the department's hard at work on. I know that I think some people I recognize on the screen have been helping with that effort, and so that's really important. Developing a holistic land use plan. Again, this is part of our suite of climate initiatives to figure out how do we balance these important priorities? How do we balance conservation with development, affordable housing, with clean energy? And then all of what I would call all of the plans, but really important to cite. We've all worked together on a really ambitious set of goals. A lot of them are interlocking and interrelated, and we need to work together to advance those. Federal funding, we are applying for a lot of federal funding. I'll just say quickly, we applied for a very large NOAA grant, Climate Resilience Challenge grant, which if we get it, and I think we have a really good chance, will provide some new funding for coastal land protection, restoration, as well as exploring a blue carbon program. So I hope through this sort of rapid fire, quick examples, I've sort of painted a picture of how we're intertwining conservation and climate goals. And I just want to emphasize that we do, government has a role, but we have a role in setting the table. And we only succeed when we work with partners who have the expertise to help carry all of this out. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you so much. We're going to hear from Mark Wamsley now. Conservation Director with Kestrel Land Trust. Mark has been actively involved in land conservation in the Pioneer Valley for more than a decade with the trustees of reservations and as a board member of the Nonotuck Land Fund. Mark draws on training as an anthropologist and a landscape architect to pursue his conservation passion, helping landowners and communities find the common ground necessary to protect the places we all love. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much, Liz, for the introduction. It is great to see everyone this afternoon. And we look very much forward to welcoming everyone to Amherst in a few days for the MLTC conference. It's really an honor to be part of this esteemed panel once again. I have to say, as someone who has their head in the details of land deals most of the time, when I was first asked to present on the topic of integration for resiliency, it sounded a bit intimidating and maybe even a little nebulous. But I think if we all pull back, we can understand that as land trusts, we're actually where integration happens on the ground. Not only that, integration is very powerful. It helps us set our goals. It guides our missions as organizations. It makes us more effective, and it can also be very compelling. So if we can, Liz, go on to the, and the next one. There you go. Thank you. Many of you know that Kestrel is a regional land trust that serves the Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts, and we have a very broad mission, really, that relates to our landscape and the communities we serve. That ranges from habitat protection and resilience to farmland conservation and food security to ensuring that communities have equitable access to the outdoors. Next. And with that broad palette, the impetus for land projects and our strategic plans really come from two directions. The scientific data and the maps and plans and initiatives they drive, like Undersecretary Cooper mentioned, and then directly from the needs and wishes of the communities where we work. So we may view that land protection project as that 30 acres, as that 100 acres, but I mean, it's really being driven both from above and below to get where we need to be. Next. The scientific data that drives the work is really familiar to all of you, and I'm glad that David mentioned that it really ranges from natural systems to social and cultural information. We're all familiar with Biomap. We all use these maps and plans as we do our daily work, and as we set up our missions. Next. And then there are all the initiatives and funding programs, many of which Undersecretary Cooper mentioned. Again, they're growing rapidly and it's absolutely wonderful, and it's a little tough to keep pace with all of them, but we hope to, certainly, because there's so many wonderful opportunities out there, and they're really touching on so many different areas and so many different areas where we can work, sometimes where we didn't even think we could work. So again, just wonderful resources that are out there for us to reach out to. Next. So I just wanted, with all that, to provide a sampling of Kestrel projects that demonstrate how the idea of integration becomes real on the ground. So with the first, we compare habitat and connectivity data like Biomap with resilience data, like with groups that TNC and UMass have put out, and pair them together and seek funding from sources like DCS's Landscape Partnership Grant Program, like we did for our current Mountain Waters project, which is seeking to conserve a little over 1,000 acres up in the northwest corner of Southampton, surrounding Pomeroy Mountain and Ty Carmody Reservoir. You can go next. Or you can pair that data with a federal program like Forest Legacy and even make the landscape scale even bigger. Like we're trying to do right now with something we kind of call the Go Big project. It's not its official name, but to really expand the partnerships and the landscape and the size of the funding source and see if we can even protect larger acreage, but still root that in the scientific data, connectivity, habitat conservation, and see how we can make it work. Next. Or we can take another approach and we can pair environmental justice data and data on urban heat islands with various funding sources such as LWCF and MVP, and Community Development Block Grant, as we're doing in an urban forest park restoration project at Anniversary Hill Park in Holyoke right now. This is a classic environmental justice project where a community natural resource was cleaved in half in the 1960s by I-91, causing basically half the park to become defunct and fall into disrepair. And what a resource for an urban population who, as you can see from the map on the right, is one of the worst urban heat islands in the Commonwealth. To bring this park back would be really a wonderful opportunity, and being able to kind of pair that data with a funding source to prove our point, why this project is important, is just really invaluable. Next. Or you can get a head start on something like the Farmland Action Plan, responding to various community needs for food security. One of our biggest projects recently, there was a few represented here. We did land searches for the Food Bank of Western Mass. We did work with the Pioneer Valley Workers Center, and we've done 2 projects with a group of immigrant and refugee farmers called All Farmers. For the latest one, you can see it in the lower left-hand corner here, we helped that group acquire 120 acres of farmland on the Westfield River, just west of Springfield, one of the largest farms left that close to Springfield. And we were able to use an MDAR Urban Ag Grant to do so. So really, and you can also see kind of the proximity of that farm to the farmers markets in the American Brightwood neighborhoods that All Farmers serve, to really see kind of how all this can come together. Again, the data, the funding, and in this case, really the kind of the community need coming from the ground up. Next. Or you can try and bridge multiple community needs, seeking to address things like land access, climate resilience, and in this case, affordable housing, like we're trying to do with our Growing Green project in East Hampton, which is supported by a DCS Conservation Partnership grant. And they have been thrilled to support the project, I think particularly because all the benefits that it has and how innovative it is. This particular project, we will be acquiring 53 acres with an affordable housing partner called the Community Builders. 10 acres of that will be split off and will host 87 units, 87 fully affordable rental units. And we will be conserving 43 acres of farmland and forest along the Manhan River, and really delving into that conservation land and designing the conservation land to work with the housing so that they're mutually beneficial and we can support that new neighborhood as it grows in East Hampton. Next. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that you could make your impact even broader, both in scale and in scope, if you indeed partner. You know, this presentation originally came together for the RCP conference, so I definitely wanted to give a shout out, because a lot of our work only happens by partnering. You can only do so much by yourself as an organization, particularly as you know, a regional land trust. So pulling everyone together when we all have similar goals to work on different topics and in a much broader landscape is really a wonderful opportunity. Next. And lastly, something I'm just realizing even more, it really helps, the idea of integration really helps you to tell the story of why we're doing what we're doing, which hopefully generates even more public support. I think communities, from what we've heard, and individual supporters really love to understand again. I mean, they know in their kind of hearts why they're connected to the land, but to see it connected to the science, to see it connected to a broader vision, I just think it makes it even more powerful connection for the work we do for the communities. So again, thank you very much. It was great to see you all.
Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing all this really excellent work that you're doing. It's wonderful. So we're going to now hear finally from Amy Sheldon. Amy is a member of the Vermont House of Representatives, where she served since 2014. So she is currently the chair of the House Committee on Environment and Energy. Amy has extensive experience in land use planning, having served on local and regional planning boards, and is currently a consulting natural resource planner. Amy is also a senior faculty member at the National Outdoor Leadership School. So Amy, if you would.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Liz. Next slide. Good afternoon, everybody. It's surely a pleasure to be here. And I am going to bring you a little perspective from Vermont, and I'm going to share a little bit about my philosophy, my legislative strategy, and a few successes that we've had over the past few years that are really focused on integrating policies that will address climate resilience. Excuse me. Next slide. So just briefly, a little bit of background. Obviously, I'm from the legislative branch, and I think it's important to understand my committee of jurisdiction currently is quite broad and somewhat lined up directly with what Stephanie addressed at the beginning of this talk. But we're the House Environment and Energy Committee, and we are focused on conservation and development, climate change, mitigation, land resources, air, water, and wildlife, and solid waste management, energy utilities, telecom, broadband, and other similar policies. So we can do almost anything in the climate realm. Next slide, please. Just another reprise of David's talk. We're addressing 3 concurrent crises. And as most of you know, but I do think it's important for all of us who are working in this realm to remind ourselves that we're facing more frequent, more powerful storms, obviously more flooding and potential for fires, lots of disruption, electrical outages, and it's really adding up to what's becoming an unbearable social and economic costs, and those largely go untracked. Climate migration is certainly, it's a factor, it's a pressure for us when we're talking about our land use policies. With folks contemplating moving to the region in the midst of a housing crisis that we have up here in New England, and other impacts of climate change, and the public health impacts, which are causing an underlying stress of disease and stress for humans and also for our wild plants and animals. Next slide. So I'm really focused on an integrative approach in large part because of the mutual benefits it can hold. And I think that nature can really be the thing that brings us to our solutions. But so I focus on the resources, time, and energy on mutually beneficial outcomes to prevent myopic thinking from one solution exacerbating another crisis. So, in the building, we can be really siloed. And I think when we think about integrated approaches, we can move beyond that and always manage holistically. So in practice, it means holding the vision for a functioning landscape where biodiversity can thrive front and center as we take action to address the crises that affect humanity in terms of the public health and the climate crisis. And my underlying philosophy is that if we can integrate nature back into our daily life, we can address all 3 of these. Next slide. So within the committee, I like to do what I call set the table with science. So I develop policies by utilizing the best, most recent science with open, honest dialogue among committee members. And it's remarkable what folks who may come to the committee with a different philosophy can do when they're presented with the realities of the 3 crises that we're trying to address. I focus also on the process of legislating. We can get panicked because there's so much to do, but when you really take the time to do things well, you can bring people along. Focus on holding the long view with science-based policies and keeping businesses accountable and keeping things as simple as possible. Certainly focused on properly funding our government and our non-government partners who implement much of the work that I'll be talking about. And finally, supporting our state and regional local planning, which is key to addressing the challenges and the role of government in supporting this work. Next slide. So in Vermont, I'm sure many of you are very aware of some of the long-term conservation work that's been happening. A lot of it through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which has been working on both the creation of affordable housing and funding conservation for over 35 years. Additionally, in Vermont, we have an underlying vision for a functional landscape, which is Vermont Conservation Design. And it is using science to identify landscape features necessary to support the continuation of 80% of our species. So this is the foundation of the work that I've brought to our committee as we've tried to address climate resilience through land use policies. Next slide. So kind of looking back now, after 10 years in the body, I realized that I've been on a bit of a mission that has become more clear as the time's gone by. But one of the first bills I introduced was in 2016 to require state and local planning commissions to map forest blocks and habitat connectors, which is primarily the data that you saw on the previous slide around Vermont conservation design. Following up on that, last year we were able to update our current use program in Vermont, which we have about 2 million acres of forest land enrolled in the current use program in Vermont. So and it's very much focused on active management, and we were able to make some small changes that will allow for landowners who want to and whose properties are eligible to manage for old forest characteristics. Next, we were able to update our wanton waste bill, which is focused on the wasting of wildlife resources. And we actually ended up with a really strong bill, one of the strongest in the country, at least back when we passed it a couple of years ago. Last year, we passed the Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act, which creates a vision for Vermont that establishes the goals for biodiversity protection, conserving 30% of our land and water by 2030 and 50% by 2050. And that process is currently underway and starting out with an inventory of existing conserved lands. And then finally, and almost literally as I speak, we are working on a bill H687 that really would complement the Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act of last year. And we're naming it the same thing and calling it Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection through changes to our land use policies. Next slide. So a little high-level overview of our 50 by 50 bill, which is that it creates a vision for Vermont of to maintain an ecologically functional landscape that sustains biodiversity, maintains landscape connectivity, supports watershed health, promotes climate resilience, supports working farms and forests, provides opportunities for recreation and appreciation of the natural world, and supports the historic settlement pattern of compact villages surrounded by rural lands and natural areas. It sets up definitions for what conservation means, and they're all focused on biodiversity. 3 types of conserved lands are ecological reserves, which are more what you would think of as a wilderness area, biodiversity conservation areas, which are focused on particular species or natural community types, and natural resource management areas, which would be more like the working farmlands, working forest lands. It also codifies the goals of conserving 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. Next slide. This year's bill really builds on that by, it's a complement. So we have the land conservation piece from last year, and then this year we're updating hoping to update our statewide land use policies. And we're doing that by utilizing that vision that I just read to you, professionalizing the Natural Resources Board, which actually oversees our statewide land use regulation in Vermont, and moving our statewide land use regulation towards more location-based jurisdictional triggers rather than somewhat arbitrary size of parcel-based or number of subdivision or units being contemplated to be built, which is what it's been based on. And updating and organizing and holding our regional planning commissions a little bit more accountable and having them support towns in their mapping of resources, which sort of goes back to the very first bill that I mentioned, where we were requiring towns to do a better job in mapping landscape features. And finally, as a complement to all of this, it updates our economic development incentive program to support these goals. So we are trying to help communities invest in places where we want to see growth and development happen, while also planning better for the conservation of the outlying landscape. Next slide. So finally, just a little thoughts, back to my philosophy, but how NGOs can help folks in the legislature in moving integrated approaches forward to address the climate issues, but helping get the message out that community resilience is dependent on intact functioning ecosystems. I think accepting the need for adaptive management. There's a lot of great science that's happening, and it's happening pretty quickly, and integrating that into your work and helping policymakers integrate it into their work is key. Working together to implement and pass the needed statutory changes, at least in Vermont, sometimes can feel a little bit lonely in the building. There are a lot of legislators who are really aware of all of these issues, but getting folks into the building to work on educating us and helping us identify next steps is really important. Thinking creatively about new tools for landscape conservation is key. We can't do it all through acquiring, for example, 50% of the landscape. We're going to need to find other ways to work with private landowners to conserve the functional landscape that we need. And last but not least, I think being bold, being in the building for 10 years, I've realized that in Vermont, folks are really ready for us to do more. They expect more, and they're excited when we bring out bold actions and move things forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you for sharing the amazing work you're doing in Vermont, and thank you all the panelists for bringing your leadership here to this panel today and to this group. Each of you is really a leader in your field and doing important things. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to just open and ask if anyone has questions. If you would like to put your questions in the chat, please go ahead and do that, and you can turn your camera on, I think, now, if you would like to. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat, or use the raise hand feature at the bottom reactions. You should be able to raise your hand and you will appear in my upper left, and I'll be able to call on you. And we'll start. Rob, would you like to have something to say to introduce? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the great panel. I was intrigued by Amy's presentation. Of course, we always like to look across state lines for cool things that are possible. And I wanted to ask kind of a clarifying question of you, but then pitch to Stephanie the question, a related question, which is, I wondered if you could comment on how much of that really aggressive 50% by 2050, how much of that would be achieved through land use controls versus acquisition of fee title or easement. So you did mention we can't acquire it all. But that left me wondering, are you implying that some of it would be controlled through regulation or land use control? For example, we have wetlands regulations that provide some de facto protection of land that's still in private ownership, not subject to an easement. Is that what you mean? Is the strategy to get to 50%? But the corollary, which I'll just throw after hearing from you, I'd love to hear Stephanie's thoughts on whether land use controls are seen as much of a tool for helping us achieve our 40 by 50 goals, or are we really focused on acquisition, permanent protection through acquisition of fee or conservation restriction interests? So that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, we don't really know. We're in the process. The first year of this is the inventory of what's actually been conserved already. And Liz is actually working a lot more on the details of this than I am. But we know that in Vermont, we're pretty far behind on our old forest goals. So I guess when I think about that, we also know that we're about 24% permanently conserved already. So we may find the path forward for 50% through permanent kind of fee acquisition, permanent conservation. The key, though, is strategically identifying those resources, the land base that's going to support the full range of our species in the different biophysical regions in the state. So I think and I guess I put that out there as, in Vermont, we have this really strong and well subscribed current use program with, like I said, 2 million acres of folks enrolled in it, but it really does force people into an active forest management paradigm. And that's great. It supports the forest products industry, but it doesn't meet some of the old forest goals. And so I guess what I was really referring to was looking for different ways to support a broader spectrum of landowner goals in meeting the biodiversity needs of our conservation plan, if that makes sense. And I guess we're not talking about using land use regulation to prohibit development. We're really talking about using it to guide better land use decisions, like clustering in areas where we can find important resources, for example, as one tool. But like, how do we do that at the state level? I know how towns can do it at the local level, and a lot of our towns are already adopting that kind of land use regulation. But we also have a lot of towns in Vermont who are under-resourced and not doing a lot of proactive planning or regulating land use. So they depend on the state to help them. Did I get all that?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank
Well,
you.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Liz.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, okay, so I would agree with everything Amy said, and in particular when she was speaking at the end about, land use is really a tool, right? Good land use planning helps us, we believe, balance, when done well, balance and achieve all of our needs. So get to the aggressive conservation, but also, balance and allow for all of the rest of the human needs. People need places to live, people need transportation, and things like that. And, Amy, I think you mentioned cluster zoning, and I was thinking about that too. That's what we call natural resource protection zoning in Massachusetts helps us, lay that out at the community level, and then conserve important areas and resources while communities can grow and develop sustainably. And then I would note too, for reaching our conservation goals, yeah, we think about acquisition, but we know it can't be nearly all acquisition. We think about easements and other partnerships with landowners, our current use program too. And, there are other tools like our sort of farm viability, shorter term or sort of path to conservation type partnerships with landowners. And I do think the wetlands protection allows for some of that too. Whether there's a specific tool there, I'm not sure, but it does help us preserve those resources. So I do think it's very much a sort of broad spectrum approach.
We've got a question coming up in the chat that's, how does carbon sequestration enter evaluation of grant applications? For example, land acquisition projects. And this is from Julie Caswell. Who would like to address that? Go ahead, Stephanie.
I can weigh in. Well, what I would say is that we, some of our grant programs we're updating the criteria all of the time, but we ask for what are the sort of the climate mitigation benefits of a particular project, right? And so more just in sort of all of our programs, we're more looking at how can you kind of quantify the sequestration values, but we don't particularly ask that question. But we have other ways of, sort of the mapping tools and everything else that we talked about in the course of this presentation help us evaluate what the mitigation value can be of a property.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I have a question which I really want to address to each of the panelists. And it came up for me when I was listening to Mark talk in particular, all of the amazing things that you're doing, the successes that you're having at Kestrel Land Trust. And you wonder how you communicate with other land trusts of perhaps similar size and staffing and capacity and so forth, or any other land trusts throughout the region, and how you share these stories with others. And you talked about the Regional Conservation Partnership and that's certainly one way. Are there other ways? Do you have regular conversations with other land trusts about the work that you're doing? And I'll let you answer that, Mark. And if others want to, but I want to ask everyone how each of the panelists, how they share the successes with others in the region. Go ahead, Mark. Thanks.
Well, I think you certainly put your finger on something there, Liz. Opportunities like this, opportunities like, the Regional Conservation Partnership Conference and MLTC conference coming up. I mean, those are certainly broad audiences right there. But we do reach out, more is somewhat just on a collegial social basis, kind of keeping in touch. It's a small community, luckily large enough to get a lot of good projects done. But we do have kind of informal contacts, and a lot of it is as needed. I was, again, remiss not to mention some of the other partners for some of these projects, where we reach out to where we need either a bridge loan, or we need a conservation restriction holder, or we need another type of partner. Several of the projects that I mentioned, we're working with Mass Audubon and other groups. I saw Ed Hood from Norcross on there, who's supporting our Growing Green East Hampton project. So yeah, I would think then it's really key. A lot of us have been doing this for a while. I've been doing it probably since 2005. I think it's really valuable to make sure that new people coming into the conservation community start making those connections, and we encourage those connections and that kind of reciprocity and partnering between groups. So I think that's a key thing as well.
Great, thank you, Mark. Before we go to the others, which we might run out of time, but Daniel Leahy asks, why is Massachusetts setting a goal of protecting 40% by 2050 rather than 50% by 2050?
Yeah, so I get what I can say about that is that that goal was set before I came into my role. I know it sounds like a sort of a non-answer, but it's the truth. And so I know that it was based on, sort of evaluation and consideration by a prior administration about what kind of goal do they want to set. So that's what I would say about that. It's something, the Forces Climate Solutions report that I mentioned from the panel of experts, of whom David Foster is a member, recommended that we increase it to 50%. So it is, that's something that people are thinking about.
Thank you, Stephanie. And David, did you have something that you wanted to add?
No, I'm very pleased to hear Stephanie provide that answer. I'm also pleased to hear her point to the Climate Forestry Committee report, and yes, that recommendation was made by a number of the committee members. And of course, I think that we all recognize that this is a work in progress, and reaching the goals that we currently have out there, 40% for Massachusetts, 50% for Vermont. Those are huge goals. And as I think Rob's question alluded to, and certainly Amy requested, we need as much innovation and as many approaches as we can to reach that. It's actually comparable. We currently have a goal within our thinking and our vision of 10% of the region in wildlands. And do we think that is the correct number? No, but if we can reach 10%, we'll be in a much better position to gauge what we may need in addition to that. But just reaching 10% is a huge stretch at this point.
Great, thank you. Thank you, David. Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Rob and Barbara for this event. Would you like to wrap up, Rob? I'll just, encourage people to get to the conference this weekend, and thank you so much.
No, and thank you, Liz, for moderating a great panel. We're so glad it's recorded so people can take advantage of it after the fact. And we do look forward to seeing many of you on Saturday. Thanks, everybody.